Steam has fallen from grace. What once stood as a platform full of interesting titles, a place for games to thrive, now stands as a monument to the garbage pail. To find the gems inside, we must filter through loads of bad to get to the good. But that's what I'm here for, to take the brunt of the negative, to hopefully find something good so that you don't have to. We'll be taking a look at some of the worst reviewed games on Steam. I picked 10 games that were among the mixed, negative, and overwhelmingly negatives. As you already know, I always try to give each game on the list a fair shot. I try to give each game a full chance to see if it has something promising in store. I will always point out the positives about each game, and of course the very negatives. I've tried to be as fair and impartial as I can with this list. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to once again talk about bad games. The Grinch Christmas Adventures is the first game on our list. I figured it was only fitting that since the holidays are approaching, I include a recently released Christmas travesty. The game was developed by Casual Brothers Limited. Casual Brothers have developed some massive licensed projects, some you might even recognize, like Paw Patrol on a Roll, Peppa Pig World Adventures, and Bluey, the video game. That really seems to be the only thing that they do develop, are large franchise licensed games. Most of the games have positive reviews, but it can be hard to tell what the actual reception is on Steam because most of the reviews are jokes or memes. The Grinch technically has mixed reviews with far less memes, so the reception is pretty clear. But everyone seems to be towing the line here. They can't really decide if the game is just fine or if it crosses the line into actually bad. I have to say that I ended up in a similar place. The game itself is a 3D platformer. We play the Grinch and his dog Max as they try to escape the caves, head across the countryside, and eventually down into Whoville to ruin Christmas. The game actually uses a 3D model of the book to introduce specific sections, which I thought was a nice touch. The extras menu even has what seems to be some concept art for the book. I'm not sure if this is the actual original art or if this was just the developers sketching the thing out beforehand. It would be an odd thing to include because the entire book is also included itself. The presentation isn't exactly terrible. Some of the textures are a little off and look strange against higher res models, but for the most part I think the game looks alright. It has a similar presentation to a lot of the licensed games that would have come out in the PS2 and PS3 generations. The cutscenes do have this odd problem though where it just repeats sound effects over and over again while the narrator is reading.
'Tis the season of cheer, and Christmas is looming. But the Grinch isn't happy. In fact, he is fuming.
A lot of the narration for cutscenes is done in a Dr. Seuss style, which is a fun idea at first, but it just gets really old after a bit. We can skip this narration, but trying to do that at first creates a hellish noise that makes me feel like I'm spinning a record backwards.
This spider looks different, with stickier strings. It doesn't just dangle, it looks like it swings.
The gameplay on its own is pretty simple though. It's a platformer, so it has a lot of the standard things that come along with that package. We jump around and collect presents, which are just a collectible and nothing more. But we can also find hidden puzzle pieces. These are used outside of the levels in the menu to unlock new features. We can unlock a double jump, a candy cane lasso, and even some cosmetics. Over time, we will eventually be able to unlock the full Santa suit, which I thought was a nice idea. It did actually inspire me to go searching for more puzzle pieces. I'm not really a huge fan of locking the mechanics of the game around hidden collectibles though. That doesn't seem like the best option that they could have picked. The platforming itself isn't that great. It feels really rough to jump most of the time, and the double jump barely adds any height at all. We also come to a full stop when we land, which slows down traversal quite a bit. But Grinch isn't just a platformer. The game is mostly split up into 2 sections without counting the very sparse snowboard levels. When we play the Grinch, we're either platforming or doing stealth. We can sneak around houses to steal presents and puzzle pieces from gingerbread men and the Who's of Whoville. These are easily the single worst part of the game. When we walk, we make sound which fills up a meter at the top of the screen. If the meter gets full, the people in the house come out of the woodwork to hunt us down. This usually means we have to hide under a table or in a wardrobe. It ends up being such a pain in the ass to wait for everyone to return back to their spots. Enemies will also sometimes get stuck on the stairs, so we're forced to take damage to get past them. These are most of the problems that exist with these sections, but the biggest problem is just how often we have to do them. Some of the later levels will have 3 or 4 stealth sections per level. It's just nuts and takes so much time. It's a drastic shift from jumping around platforms. There are some very simple puzzles to solve out in the world though. These usually require our dog, Max, who acts as our companion for the game. Max can be played with a second character, but he is rarely ever used. Maybe every other level will have a puzzle that requires him. I would often forget he was even there in the first place. Max will often have to get back to us as well after a puzzle that requires his use, and the developers just decided that he should straight up clip through the door. When we get enough puzzle pieces, we gain the candy cane lasso, which acts as a grappling hook that we can swing on. This feature is pretty funny for 2 reasons. One, because the tutorial video for the features shows the developers using it wrong, and 2, because when we shoot it out, it kinda looks like Grinch's... You know what, never mind. One of the funniest things that happens in the game, though, is when the narrator introduces a new mechanic, he just gives a 2-word statement describing it energetically.
Seesaws. Push rocks. Heavy door.
I say all of this about the game to point out the negatives, but honestly, a part of me kind of enjoyed my short time with this game. Now, what I'm about to say is not an endorsement, and I'm not saying that you should go buy it, because $40 is probably a waste of your money if we're being honest. But playing the game brought me back to the bargain bin licensed games that I would play as a kid. Now, that obviously speaks to the quality of the project, that this felt like a game that came out 15 years ago, but it gave me a slight tinge of nostalgia. It reminded me of playing games like Battle for Bikini Bottom or X-Men Legends 2 Rise of Apocalypse. Not that this game has anything in common with X-Men Legends 2, but you get the point. There's a certain charm to it, and honestly, I know what you're thinking. It doesn't matter because it's a kid's game. Yes and no. I struggled with that idea while playing this game. Part of me feels like it should be held to a lesser standard because it's a kid's game, and it can be given breaks in places where other games wouldn't. Then the other part of me feels like kids' games should be held to a higher standard. I honestly don't really know where I landed at on this debate inside myself, but at the end of the day, I know that I just kind of liked the game. A little bit. But I also hated that. Maybe it's just the tale of the Grinch, artificially inflating my heart 3 sizes. Who knows?
Heavy door.
Wave of Darkness is a game that is on the complete other side of the spectrum when compared to the Grinch. The game was developed by Dreamatrix, or Dream Matrix. They mostly developed RTS games and ARPGs. They actually released Wave of Darkness and another ARPG called Legends of Dawn Reborn within a month of each other. They haven't released a game since 2016, which was a Bejeweled clone, so I can't say that they're exactly doing well. Wave of Darkness was released in November 2015 and is an action RPG. This is probably the part of the video where I would give you a brief overview of the story of Wave of Darkness, but I actually have no idea what the fuck is going on. There really aren't any cutscenes, no introduction, we're just on a ship all of a sudden, and most of the narrative is delivered to us through these hard to read and incredibly long text boxes. We actually start the game on a tutorial island that just allows us to wander around and try to find the mechanics of the game. I really hate this idea because I do like exploring in video games. I like finding little secrets and extras, but the worst thing I could ever think as a reward for exploration is a tutorial. Once we exit the tutorial island, we are whisked away and given a few quests. Now, Wave of Darkness actually has a presentation that I'm kind of alright with. It reminds me of some classic RPGs. It certainly has a bit of a homegrown and comfy style to it. It feels like there should be something nice here, something interesting, but there really isn't. The game has a massive quality of life problem. The map is a cluttered mess. We can barely figure out where we need to go, what quest is which. There's no legend in the game as far as I could tell, so we can't tell exactly what anything is. The quest descriptions also don't exactly help us figure out what we need to do to complete a quest. We're just kind of left to wander. Now, I'm definitely not going to be the guy that complains about a game not holding my hand enough. Modern games have a ridiculous amount of hand-holding, and it's one of the only things that will genuinely frustrate me because I think it ruins the experience. But this game desperately needs some more guidance for the player. Maybe I'm just a noob that randomly stumbled onto a self-proclaimed hardcore ARPG, but I don't really think that's the case. There's a difference between guiding a player with good game design and just mashing things together and hoping they work. Top all this off with the fact that Wave of Darkness doesn't give you any skills off the bat. Leveling is also incredibly slow. This causes the first level of the game to just have us whacking at enemies with our sword. There's no strategy or challenge in combat. It's just very, very bland. Overall, there just isn't a lot going on here. Not a lot in the way of design, presentation, or combat. It's particularly hard to compete in the ARPG genre, especially back in 2015 when most of the really good ones were fresh in our minds. Wave of Darkness does not compete. Lightning Fast was a game that I really had high hopes for. Let me explain the basic premise to you. You create your own leopard, you stalk the grasses of the Divok Plains, take down your prey, eat, hunt, sleep, survive. Sounds pretty badass, right? Yeah, this game sucks. The failure that is Lightning Fast can be explained pretty simply. It was abandoned. It was an early access game released in 2021 that was developed by Step Games. It was their first and seemingly only project to date. The game's last update was in May of 2023, and they fixed like 3 bugs for the game. The whole point of the game is to create a leopard and then survive as that leopard, growing and leveling up. I will say, letting me make a freakish little cub with purple eyes is pretty awesome, so I can't fault them for that one. We can run around and sniff out prey, but the only problem is the prey don't care that we attack them. They just stand there. They just let us decimate them. I'm not really sure how attacking works because your leopard hangs off the prey as its stamina runs out. There seems to be some type of QTE to stop yourself from falling off, but I just couldn't find a single button on my keyboard that would work with this. It's incredibly odd and janky, just blatantly unfinished. We can take our kill elsewhere though and save it for later. We keep our leopard alive by keeping it fed and hydrated. Finding water and food is crucial, but not that difficult when all the other animals of the world are frozen in time. The depressing part about this project is that it's actually kind of cool. I would really like to play a simulator game where you play as a natural predator hunting beasts in the wilderness. Something like Spore, but for leopards, would be awesome. The developer actually had an idea that they could do something with. I'm not sure if they ran out of money or if they got discouraged from negative reception surrounding the initial release of the game. Either way, Lightning Fast currently stands as a woefully unfinished project that I definitely wouldn't waste my money on. Cowboy Yakuza was developed by Active Gaming Media Incorporated, a company that's name sounds like the evil corporation in an 80s action movie. You'd be fooled into thinking that the studio had a pretty great resume if you looked at the games they've published on Steam. Both of their other projects, the 25th Ward, The Silver Case, and Yumaniki Dream Diary, both have very positive reviews. Except Active Gaming Media didn't fully develop these games, they just worked on them. It seems that their specialty is in localization, so they probably were just responsible for that aspect of development. The streak goes both ways though. 25th Ward was developed by Grasshopper, and Suda51 actually assisted on development for Cowboy Yakuza. The game is technically still in early access, but has no updates whatsoever, and was released in 2020, so it's seemingly abandoned. The game sees us playing a character named Cleveland Waingro, an African-American immigrant to Japan. The game begins in the final chapter of the story, where Cleveland is kicked out of the Yakuza. We then start back at the beginning to figure out how he got to where he is now. The game itself is a top-down beat-em-up. We can use light or heavy attacks to defeat our foes. We also have a charge-up super ability that will make us all-powerful for a few seconds. This ability is actually activated in-world when Cleve takes some psychedelic drugs, so he starts to see things around him and transforms into a demon. Other than that, though, there isn't a lot more to combat. It's very simple and doesn't ever really progress. This gets incredibly tedious over time, and I assume is something that the team would have expanded upon had the project been fully realized. The story is probably the worst part of the game, though. The whole game has this very badass, I'm cool style. It's not very self-aware, though, so the whole thing just comes off as cringe. It's honestly pretty bad, and definitely isn't my kind of thing. It just really feels ingenuine, like you can see the kind of people that wrote this game in your mind. But the shame in this whole ordeal is that the style of the game overall is just fantastic. The game looks great, and I love the presentation. It definitely seems like a shorter game that I would have downloaded from the PlayStation Store when I was younger, but I would have loved it. The colors are done really well, environments are nicely modeled, characters are well drawn, the UI looks great and has the 70s style of the time period. It's just all fantastic and meshes the Yakuza with the blaxploitation films of the time. Its presentation is great, and it's also kind of a bummer that the game was never finished. There are only a few chapters available, so it just stops at a certain point. I think that if the game was complete and the combat system was fixed, I definitely still would have played this while just ignoring the cringy dialogue. Unfortunately, Active Gaming Media seems to have gone completely silent. They launched a platform called Playism to fund indie games, but that went under in 2021, and it seems like they've stuck to the localization side of things ever since. Maybe in a couple years, AGM will return to Cowboy Yakuza to finish up the project, but that seems like a pipe dream at this point. Baba Yaga Woodboy is a pixelated, minimalistic horror game developed by Marginal Act. I would assume this is a solo developer, but I can't exactly confirm that because there isn't too much information out there about them. They have many games on Steam, most of which are horror, but they do release the occasional bubbly, colorful puzzle game, which seems like an odd switch up. The game we're talking about today, though, is something that I'm incredibly conflicted on. On one hand, the game has a fantastic style. This eerie, low-poly PS1 era setting, combined with the low light and jarringly fast obstacles, creates a sort of anxiety. It really does well to make a specific sort of terror, and I like the unique design of the horror in this project. Nothing about it really feels cookie cutter. The game also uses scale incredibly well. It introduces small, claustrophobic environments to make you feel cramped and closed in, but it also introduces these massive open environments that make you feel like you're a part of something much larger. The story itself seems to tell a tale of a boy trying to get back home. We encounter his parents and family slowly uncovering the emotions and tensions that lie inside the dynamic. The game itself is something I really enjoyed in style, presentation, and aesthetic, but the places where the game goes really wrong are technical. The absolute biggest problem with the game is the mouse sensitivity. When we begin the game, we can barely move the camera around. Thankfully, there is a setting to adjust mouse sensitivity, but even bringing it all the way up still doesn't give us enough slack to move the camera properly. It's so incredibly grating and slow just to turn around or even to head into a corner. It's just awful. The worst thing that this does is disable us from being able to see scares. Oftentimes, something will appear off to our side, but before we can turn the camera, it's already gone. This completely robs the viewer of the style and the aesthetic of the game. It's an absolute shame for a project that is actually pretty interesting. The game has some other slight technical issues like text boxes popping up only in a certain small area. If we pass this area, then they're gone and we have to walk back to see what they said. The puzzles also aren't that unique for the most part. Half of them just require that we find a key to unlock a door to move forward. That's why I'm so split on the project. There is a lot of promise here, and I genuinely hope that the developer has improved. They have made one horror game since, one that actually has positive reviews, so it's definitely something that I'll try to check out in the future. It's just a shame that this style and setting had to be left to a technically broken mess. Walking Dead Destinies is an absolute shit show, and there's really no way to sugarcoat it. The game was developed by Flux Games, who only have two notable projects in their past: Cobra Kai: The Karate Kid Saga Continues, and Cobra Kai 2: Dojo's Rising. The really interesting part about this game, though, is the publisher. In my last video, we talked about the failure that was Skull Island: Rise of Kong. This game was published by Game Mill, who also published Walking Dead Destinies. The company is really on a roll recently at churning out incredibly public disasters. I can't really be as lax on Walking Dead Destinies as I was on the Monkey game, because this game is just frustratingly bad. Destinies is a third-person action-adventure game based around the first 4 seasons of the Walking Dead TV show. It actually follows a lot of the same plot, but the subtitle describes the gimmick of this project. At certain branching points of the game, you're allowed to choose what happens. Points that were fixed in the show now become a bit more open. The first choice we make in the game is to side with T-Bone or Merle on the rooftop in Atlanta. For most of the choices, I decided to pick the option that didn't happen in the show. I mostly did this because I wanted to see what would happen and how destructive the choices could be. And I'll give the game credit here. The choices can actually have some large effects. Before I explain how they affect the game, we should probably talk about the gameplay. Like I said before, the game is an action-adventure. We fight zombies around the world and complete short missions called episodes. These usually see us collecting some sort of supply, saving someone, or surviving an onslaught. We can handle zombies in one of 2 ways: stealth or open combat. Stealth is incredibly underdeveloped. We have a skill system in the game which is pretty fleshed out for the most part, but not really balanced. Each character that we meet in the story has their own skills, and buying a skill will activate that ability for all characters that we play. But the biggest problem with stealth is that if we upgrade it even slightly, the whole system just breaks. We can increase our movement speed when crouched, decrease the amount of stamina it takes to kill foes while hidden, and decrease the noise we make. It doesn't take long to get all of these talents. When we do, we can just stroll around and barely be seen by enemies while stabbing them with our knife from the shadows. It's just not difficult at all and gets out of hand really fast. The only time that it's really challenging is in the first few episodes of the game. After that, it's smooth sailing. It's also just an incredibly bland and simple stealth system overall. The only thing we do is crouch, activate our senses to see enemies and objects, and take down zombies. That's it. But of course, we'll always have to eventually fight, and sometimes we might just want some quicker paced combat. The fighting is also atrocious in its own regard. We can either use melee weapons to kill enemies or ranged weapons. We can use heavy or light attacks with the melee weapons. If we just repeatedly attack, enemies will eventually die, but if we stun them with our instrument of violence and then stab them, we can quickly take them out. It gets to a point pretty early on in the game where you figure out that you can just heavy attack an enemy and immediately take them out with the knife. You then just run away to regain stamina and do it again and again and again. There are some fun things that can be done, like using the fire axe to knock down a big group of zombies, but it really doesn't end up being that rewarding. If we take too much damage in combat, we'll actually take a scar, which will decrease one of our stats unless we complete a specific objective to get rid of it, like executing enemies with our adrenaline power-up. This was one of the only parts of combat that I thought was actually interesting, but after a while I just stopped getting that hurt, so it didn't really matter. Ranged weapons are the absolute worst though. I'm not sure if this is a PC specific issue, but the sensitivity of aiming was just way too high. The gunplay is so god awful that it was something I never wanted to use. The game does have auto aim turned on high by default, probably because the aiming was so fucked that they knew it was necessary. We will also eventually encounter human enemies at a certain point in the game, which are just the worst. They're so jittery and just move around like they're constantly spazzing. They're an absolute pain to deal with because they don't behave like normal humans. This is the point where the game truly feels like a creation of many generations past. There are also some very dumb and incredibly contrived puzzles later in the game, like one that takes way too long to move boxes out of the way to get access to a fire axe. But the skill system is where the choices actually come into play. If we make a choice that kills a character, we can no longer use skill points to unlock their abilities. The skills we've already unlocked will still have their effects, but future ones cannot be unlocked. This can actually change your game drastically if a great skill was hidden behind a now dead character. This is something I actually kind of liked about the game, and is a reason that I think the general idea that the game had kind of shows some promise. It's one of those projects that has a good idea, but just very, very poor execution. The poorest execution, though, must be in the presentation. This is why the game has already reached meme status, just like the Kong game or Gollum. The game just looks so fantastically bad. I'm not sure if this is an art style or just laziness, but whatever the trend is, it has become incredibly popular this year. First off, none of the characters really look like their TV show counterparts. They're always just like 15% off, like they had to draw them from memory, but they haven't seen the show since it first aired. It's so incredibly odd, and was something that never stopped being jarring. The cutscenes are also very poorly done. They're just still frame images with the camera slowly rotating around, or even just staying still while the characters say their lines. This is wildly lazy and just had to have been a cost-saving mechanism, because I can't think of another reason why someone would choose to do this. It just always looks really bad and cheap. It's awful. One of the worst parts about the presentation, though, is the voice acting. None of the original cast of the show returned to their roles for this game, so every voice actor is just doing a really bad impression of the actor that played the original character. The absolute worst one is Herschel, who somehow decided to just do a Bill Clinton impression.
He's out of danger for the moment.
Will he be okay?
Bullet broke into pieces. Need to get him out, but I don't have the right equipment.
What'll it take?
Nearest hospital burned down, but FEMA set up a shelter at the high school.
So they'd have what we need?
They should. But the last time we saw it, it was overrun. We couldn't get near it.
The story itself mostly just follows the show for its first 4 seasons. The game even begins with Rick escaping the hospital as he wakes up from his coma. We even get to see the famous "Don't Dead Open Inside" door. The real problem with this is that the game completely skips over large chunks of the story. It probably would have made more sense for the game to focus on just the first season of the show. When we complete an episode, the game will suddenly jump the story forward and catch us up with a text loading screen. It just makes absolutely no sense if you haven't seen the show. This limits the audience for this game only to the people who have watched the show and already know what's happening. At that point then, the game should just act as a what-if scenario, showing the viewers what could have happened. It sort of does that, but not really, because the ending isn't that different no matter what choices we make. It's just a short still image cutscene with no dialogue. There are also some really contrived choice mechanics outside of the larger story affecting ones. We can solve conflicts at camp that don't really seem to affect anything at all. We just choose a side between two people who are having an argument and get skill points for it. Each mission will also see us sending one of our camp members on an excursion. Halfway through the mission, they call in to ask us how to proceed. They will either fail or succeed based on our advice, meaning we either get skill points or don't. It's really just pointless, especially because the game has a plethora of skill points outside of this, so it only really helps us become very overpowered early on. All of these negatives don't even address the myriad of bugs and issues that the game comes with. The game is just really janky in general. Skill buys will stay after we die, but we can also recollect the skill points that we just got before. One of the worst ones was when the barn scene happened. After I opened the door to the barn, walkers just started spawning in direct view where I could see them, and they just kept spawning and spawning. Destinies is a really weird idea overall. I do think it's not a terrible concept, but even with good execution, I'm not really sure who would be buying this. I'm not the biggest Walking Dead fan. I think I stopped watching around season 5 and never came back. But even if everything here was done very well, I don't really think I'd be interested in playing it. Unless you really wanted a game with a boss battle where you fight Rick as Shane with a fire axe. If that sounds like you, then go spend that $50, champ. One Day for Ched is a game that I won't spend too much time on. It's a first-person shooter that was developed by BS1 and BSL Team. It's seemingly their only project, but the game prides itself on its level of difficulty and its hardcore nature. The game has that in spades. It is incredibly difficult, but not because of a challenging design, just because the enemies do a ton of damage. We'll usually die in 2 or 3 shots max. Most of the time we get one-shotted. There are certain enemies that shoot projectiles we can dodge, but for the most part we can't. We're also placed in tight corridors where it's difficult to even move, let alone get out of the way. It's really not something worth checking out for its well-made gunplay. The only thing that I would say this game has going for it is its aesthetic. There is something incredibly charming about the design, especially for the cutscenes. This might not be everybody's thing, and I could certainly see how this could be specific to my preference here, but I really like the silver stunted design of the characters. The gray tone in the back and even the menu things really give the game a classic feel. There's just something about it that I really think looks interesting. There's also an element of this aesthetic where I wonder if it was intentional or accidental. If it was intentional, then I think it's genuinely good. If it was accidental, then I guess it's sort of good, but I wouldn't expect anything good coming from this team in the future. Also, I should point out that the voice acting is very, very bad.
I'm drunk. I'm very, very drunk.
There isn't much of it in the game, but the places that it does pop up are pretty rough. Overall, the game just isn't there. Maybe really big fans of the FPS genre will find some fun in the challenge and push their way through, but it really just wasn't for me. Homeless Simulator 2 is a game that I originally thought was going to be a joke, but I came out way more confused than I initially thought. The game was developed by Kitty, a developer that we'll talk about again in a moment. The game itself honestly doesn't have much to do. We play a homeless person and can walk around on the street, trying to stay alive by managing our own survival bars at the bottom of the screen. We can sleep on the street to fill our sleepiness, we can eat food that we find from trash cans or begging to fill our hunger, and we can find drinks to fill our thirst. The hardest bar to fill is our heat. The only way that we can gain more heat, considering the fact that it's snowing, is by getting a hold of some matches. Matches are also found by digging through trash or begging for donations from people on the street. The only problem is that the drop rate is so incredibly low that we usually just die before we find some matches. Begging people is also not productive at all because a lot of people will get so mad at us that they would just rather beat me to death than give me a banana. Other than these few things, there really isn't anything else to do. Now, part of me thinks that this game is some sort of commentary on how we treat the homeless. The music in the background even plays this somber piano theme that tugs at the heartstrings. After playing the game a few times, you start to think that the point is to lose, to realize that the homeless are a population of individuals that we'd rather just not deal with. Now, this doesn't seem to be the case though. If we play the first game in the series, we find the exact same project but without the begging feature. Literally the only difference is not being able to ask for people's generosity, which seems to remove the theme of the game in the first place. I also went through and sampled the developers' other games to try and find the motivation behind this project, and there I found out that this game must be shovelware. Fat Prisoner Simulator 3 is a game where we play fat men in their boxers, sliding around the ice in a large hockey game. Dude Simulator 5 is a broken game where we try to become the president, but are constantly stopped by the town around us. Happy Day is a game that takes place on a street, where the only thing we can do is wish our neighbors a Merry Christmas. After playing these games, I realized that I was definitely looking too hard into things. Homeless Simulator 2 is a shovelware game that only tries to convince you of a deeper message to try and get a couple more coins out of you. Don't buy. Gamer Shop Simulator is a game that I really wanted to enjoy. I'll admit that I have a pretty big soft spot for these simulator games. I will log a ton of hours into a game that lets me manage a shop just because I want to get the number to go up and get new rugs for the place. It's an incredibly massive waste of time, but I just can't explain the pull that these games have on me. Gamer Shop Simulator almost hits the mark, but has some real fatal flaws. The game sees us taking control of someone who is about to open their first shop solely for gamers. Our first task is to hire employees, buy some stock, place some shelves, and open the business. This game has a ton of stuff to do. We can hire different employees, we can take loans from the bank to expand our business, we can manage CCTV cameras, we can run promotions, paint the place, manage prices, check reviews, we can even gamble on the computer. The game offers quite a bit of features if we want to take advantage of them, or rather, if we can make it there. The main loop of the game, though, sees us ordering product online based on the prices and the shelf space that we have in the store. We can then physically place the stock on the shelves in the store and manage the prices in our computer based on market demand. This loop continues until we make enough to make a large upgrade. The one thing that we do have to watch out for are thieves. These ne'er-do-wells will rush into our business to try and get their grubby little paws on our merchandise. We can knock them out and take it back, of course, but it's very funny because they just flop to the ground and our character doesn't even do a punching animation or anything. The biggest problem with the beginning of the game is that it's very slow. It takes 2 days for our merchandise to ship to us, so we have 2 days of doing almost nothing. We can sleep from midnight to 7 a.m., but after that we have to be at the shop. We don't have to open the shop if we don't have anything to sell, but we can't skip time. It's so boring to just sit there and wait for more stuff to come in. The other problem is that until we get a security guard later in the game, we have to just sit here and wait until a thief comes in and stop him from stealing our stuff. If we don't, then we're just losing money. The reason I want to like the game, though, is because I really enjoy the idea of being able to place merchandise physically on shelves. This creates an atmosphere where you can actually fully manage the look of your shop, which is a great concept. The rest of the game is just so poorly executed that it dies before you can even get to the good stuff. Code Shifter is the last game that we'll be talking about today. The game was developed by Landho, who seems to have only worked on dancing and cheerleading games for the Wii, which would explain the style and aesthetic that this game has. The game itself is actually an Arc System Works crossover. Arc System is known for the Guilty Gear games, the River City series, and BlazBlue, among others. This project tries to tie all of those series in together, and I was honestly surprised this game didn't get more traction considering how popular those games are. The game takes place in a programming office where the development team is working on a new fighting game called Colorful Fighters. The fighters in this game are the characters from all of the Arc System series. We can actually play this game in the office, and as new characters are unlocked in the main game, they're also unlocked here, which is a nice touch. The main game itself, though, sees us trying to debug the systems at Awesome Rainbow Corporation, the fictional company the game takes place in. We do this by playing a side-scroller game. This is how we gain access to many of the characters from the Arc System projects. We can use our main character, Sarah, an original character that the programmer uses to debug the game. This character has a pretty basic moveset, but will carry us through a lot of the earlier levels. As we progress through a level, we can pick up more characters with different movesets. Some are more chunky, slow, and can't jump as high, but have massive damage. Others are more speedy, can double jump, and have large attacks that do multiple hits. We can also gain assist fighters that can be used like an item. We have to charge their bar first, and then get to use one attack with them before they're spent. Now, the gameplay isn't exactly awful. There are a ton of characters in the game, and I think the variety of the different characters is probably the game's biggest strength. Each fighter feels like their own, and they genuinely have different styles of play and attack. The game also has a decent variety in level design. We can take multiple paths that will lead us to different challenges and rewards. It's not incredibly unsatisfying to play. Now, this isn't my genre of expertise, so I don't think it's something that I would play for hours on end unprompted, but it also isn't the worst thing in the world. The real problem with the game is twofold. Let's start with the presentation. The game mixes the pixel art style that the characters take in Colorful Fighters with the flat, dead, shaded style that everything else in this world takes. It's honestly so bad, and it looks like a Bratz game on the PSP or something. The contrast between these two styles, which mainly happens in the debugging world, just looks god-awful. The enemies look like something pulled out of a Kingdom Hearts mobile game. It's just really hard on the eyes and doesn't look like something that was particularly inspired or unique. Anyone could have designed this. The other real problem with Codeshifter is the story. The main narrative sees us trying to figure out who is messing up the code behind the game. The dialogue is incredibly bad. I said before that the gameplay isn't terrible, but during every interaction, I was begging for another level because I just really didn't care about what was happening with these characters. It just goes on so long and takes forever to get anywhere. It really just feels like the idea for an Arc System crossover game came first, and the story was all just an afterthought. The story was created as a reason to justify the game rather than the other way around. The game is really not something worth playing, and when I first stumbled upon it, I didn't even realize it had anything to do with Arc System. I'm not very well versed on any of their games. Guilty Gear definitely isn't the type of fighting game that I gravitate towards. I'm more of a Tekken man myself.
Eddie Gordo.
With that in mind, I can't fully speak to whether Arc System fans would be pleased with this, but I can say I'm not an Arc System fan, and I am not pleased with this. Well, Dad, that's another 10 of the worst reviewed games on Steam. Thanks for watching once again. This will probably be the last one of these types of videos for the year. December is going to be a pretty big month for the channel, so I figured I'd kick it off right. I'm really working hard right now to get a bunch of massive projects done before the end of the year. I hope you enjoy everything that's coming to the channel, and as always, thank you for liking and subscribing and commenting on the video. And a massive thank you to everyone that supports me over on Patreon. I really, really appreciate it. See you soon. Bye, Dad.